Marvel's Spider-Man No Way Home. There's a lot going on in this movie, and we could talk about it for hours. But today we won't be talking about all the villains in this movie, well, except for maybe one of them. We won't be talking about Charlie Cox's Daredevil, or even Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield. No, instead I want to really take a second to think about whether this is truly Spider-Man's last movie in the MCU. Or, in other words, Tom Holland's last MCU movie. I've pulled together some points that I believe to be instrumental in answering this question. Well, before the movie comes out, that is. Lastly, just keep in mind that this is only my own personal speculation. At the end of the day, this will all result in an educated guess, because, as you'll see, this situation is pretty complicated. First of all, let's remember what Sony and Disney's Spider-Man deals actually entail. Bear with me, this will prove to be relevant, I promise. When Spider-Man was first introduced back in Civil War, the deal between the two studios was quite public and pretty easy to understand. Marvel and Sony had agreed to let Spider-Man appear in 5 Marvel Studios produced movies, the first being Captain America Civil War, followed by Spider-Man Homecoming, Avengers Infinity War, Avengers Endgame, and Spider-Man Far From Home. After which, the deal would either cease or need to be renegotiated. Marvel would produce these movies, with Sony gaining roughly 5% of the profit from the team-up movies, i.e. Infinity War, Endgame, and Civil War, and 95% of the box office profit from the Spidey solo movies. A pretty good deal for them, all things considered. Now, the reason all of this was so public was because during the deal, Sony was hacked, and many documents meant to be kept under wraps were now out for the public to see, many of which pertained to the possible deal with Marvel Studios. Now, this of course brings us to 2019, when Spidey was officially out of the MCU for like a month. When the time came to renegotiate, it didn't go too well for Peter. It's unclear exactly why the deal fell through, but reports came out that suggested Sony was unhappy with the terms of the new deal, potentially having Marvel take more of the profit from the solo movies. Though this hasn't been made totally public. From what I understand, most of this is speculation. When the studios finally reached a new deal, it went a lot differently than the last. This new deal is shrouded in much more secrecy than the last one. We don't know all the details, or even many details at all. But what we do know, I put that "no" in quotations, is that Spider-Man is on contract to appear in 2 more MCU movies. After these movies, the deal is again either done or needs to be renegotiated. Obviously, one of the movies is Spider-Man No Way Home, though the second could be a few things. One prominent guess is Doctor Strange 2, given his involvement in No Way Home. However, I'm actually going to take a leap of faith and say that I think his second appearance would be the Fantastic Four movie. Though this is just a guess, I only have a couple of reasons for that. The fact that Tom has signed on for 2 more movies or projects under the MCU banner seems like proof enough that No Way Home is not the end. But just because an actor or actress is signed on for multiple projects under a studio doesn't necessarily mean they're going to be used in those projects. Just look at Aaron Taylor Johnson's Quicksilver. Guy was signed on for a few movies and they ended up killing him off in the first one. Although I won't pretend to know everything about big actor and actress contracts. It could be that because this contract is between Sony, Disney, and Tom, that it's much more set in stone than others, which I actually think is likely. But with that out of the way, let's move on to the next point. So the last deal we touched on isn't the only notable deal between these two studios. Back in April of this year, Sony and Marvel signed a pretty huge deal that would allow for Sony's movies, which obviously includes Spider-Man, to air on Disney streaming networks, most notably being the possibility of a Disney Plus release for movies like the Homecoming trilogy, and apparently even the older Spider-Man movies. That is, after they play on Netflix for their allotted time period. This deal is set to run from 2022 all the way to 2026. This is something I don't hear too many people talking about, and I do think it's worth keeping in mind. The argument could be made that if Sony and Disney plan to stop working with each other after Spider-Man 3, why would they sign this deal? Now, this doesn't mean that all of these movies will absolutely come to Disney Plus specifically, though the possibility is now open. By no means is this a smoking gun claiming that Spider-Man will stay in the MCU, though it is definitely interesting. Alright, I mentioned that we may be talking about one of the villains in Spider-Man No Way Home, and just in case you haven't seen Venom Let There Be Carnage yet, here's a spoiler alert, and feel free to skip to this time. Alright, now of course we need to talk a little bit about Venom. This was a wild card that I don't think most people saw coming. I know I didn't. At the end of Venom 2, we see Eddie and Venom get pulled into the MCU all Spider-Verse style. Seriously, the way they rendered these effects in live action is really cool. But regardless of what this could mean for his status in No Way Home, which is just so exciting, I think this has pretty important implications for the nature of Sony and Marvel's partnership. If Venom appears in No Way Home, and honestly, it probably doesn't even matter for this to be true given that Tom Holland appeared in Venom 2's post-credit scene. However, it would likely mean that Venom was a part of this 2-movie deal that they signed, at least in a small part. Sony can't just go putting Venom into the MCU without asking. This, of course, needs to be run through Kevin Feige. Man is kind of a control freak, which isn't a bad thing. Honestly, I think it's the reason the MCU has been so successful. Now, it's very likely that Venom is not going to have a huge role in the MCU, or even No Way Home, and he'll likely get placed back into his universe in due time. But it's worth noting that initially it seemed like Sony really wanted Venom to be, quote, adjacent to the MCU.
But you never know when Spider-Man is going to end up interacting with Venom because that's inevitable.
Maybe.
Tom Holland will always be, as far as we're concerned, Tom Holland will always be our Spider-Man.
They know full well what kind of publicity that would give him. So, now that they've seemingly gotten what they wanted from the start, at least for now, it would seem weird to me if they just undid all of this so soon. However, Sony's done crazier things in the past, so it's also not completely off the table. Bringing Venom into No Way Home could just be setting up Tom's grand exit from the MCU, which is very possible. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about what Sony might do with the Venomverse and Spider-Man if they took him back in this last section. Okay, but what about what Tom Holland said? Tom's comments were very interesting. He was basically playing around the question regarding his future in the role and said something along the lines of, if we get the opportunity to play these characters again, they would be very different versions, and that on their last day of filming, they were unsure if this was the last time they would all be filming Spider-Man together, referring to him, Zendaya, and Jacob, who of course plays Ned. I believe these comments are the result of the ending of the film and the contractual uncertainty of it all. What I mean by that is I feel like No Way Home will somehow end in a way that could be left open for interpretation. Either that or Ned literally dies, and that was what he meant when he said that this was potentially the last time they would all be filming together, though I think that's kind of unlikely. That seems a little too on the nose even for Tom Holland. But besides, Marvel and Sony are cranking the multiverse doors wide open now, so even if Spider-Man is jettisoned out of the MCU to go fight Venom at the end of No Way Home, this doesn't mean he couldn't come back at some point in the future. I personally believe that Sony will inevitably find themselves in a place where their movies start to underperform once Venom 3 comes out and Spider-Man is rebooted for a 4th time. Well, if they take him out of the MCU, that is. So now here's where I want to talk a little bit about what would happen if Sony took Spider-Man back. Personally, I believe that if Sony takes Spider-Man back, it's hard to deny that they are looking more in terms of the now than they are in the future. And what I mean by that is Venom was very successful. Venom Let There Be Carnage seems to be very successful. So some people might point to this as proof towards Sony not needing Marvel anymore, which I think there's credence to that point. However, if you look at Sony's upcoming slate, do you really think Morbius and Kraven the Hunter are going to be as successful as Venom? I personally just don't think they're as easily palatable for the general audience as someone like Venom. And yes, if they take Spider-Man back, then they would be able to put him in those projects. However, I think Sony would find themselves in a bit of an issue that DC seems to be facing, which is honestly just confusion among general audiences and oversaturation of spider-based characters. If Sony takes Spider-Man back, then all of the stories they have to tell are going to be based in the character and only the characters they have access to. The more Sony goes on and the more they make Spider-Man movies, the more saturated the market is going to become with characters like maybe Spider-Gwen, Miles Morales, all of the Sinister Six villains except probably new versions of them, because if they take Spider-Man back, and let's be clear, unless this is specified in their weird deal somewhere, Tom probably wouldn't be able to mention the Avengers or Iron Man, even if they don't appear in his movie, which would act as a sort of soft reboot to the character, something that I don't think people are exactly clamoring to see. Sony would inevitably find themselves in a place where their movies start to underperform because people are quite simply getting tired of them. Whereas if Spider-Man stays in the MCU, you have a lot more stories you can tell with the character, and you can take your time before introducing, say, a Miles Morales or a Spider-Gwen, because in some way, Sony needs to make their movies interesting, and they're going to start pulling at all the cards they have to keep them interesting. But hey, maybe I'm way off base on this. Maybe the majority of people really do have faith in Morbius and Sony going forward. Maybe you think that Sony will find a way to not oversaturate the spider market, or maybe that's just what people are looking for. This could all just be my opinion. But with all that being said, what do you think? Will Spidey stay in the MCU a while longer or head back over to Sony? How do you think No Way Home is gonna end? Personally, I'm thinking he's probably gonna stay in the MCU and that the door will probably be left open, but hey, there are really good cases to be made for both sides. As for now, if you enjoyed, consider subscribing. Though if even one person enjoyed this, that's quite enough for me. See ya.